There is a headline over at the Wall Street Journal this morning. Hamas is losing every battle in Gaza. It still thinks it could win the war. And Sinwar actually has a quote in there, "We've got Israel right where we want them." What do you think?
Well, militarily, Israel has been winning the war. They've taken out the vast majority of Hamas battalions, and that the debate now is whether they go into Rafah, and the debate is whether to focus on a big deal that would exchange some hostages, 40 to 50 or so, as has been reported in the press, for Palestinian prisoners, and to have a pause at least for a number of weeks in the fighting. I don't think that's going anywhere, despite what President Biden said last week. But the challenge is sort of the diplomatic dance that Bibi is doing with both the U.S. and other Western allies, and the military need to kind of finish the job and find Sinwar, take him out, and end the war by taking out Hamas leadership in Rafah.
I listened to a podcast yesterday, for heaven's sake, Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi talking about, do we go into Rafah, do we not go into Rafah? I don't think they have any choice but to go into Rafah. They may open up a humanitarian corridor for a week to let women and children out, but they got to go in, don't they? They can't leave Hamas alive and cornered.
I mean, that's what the majority of the Israeli public, based on polls and based on just the internal debate in the war cabinet, himself yesterday made a comment saying, like, we're going to go, underscoring that there is going to be at some point, an offensive into Rafah. The question is the timing. The question is there any deal that can be struck, in the interim to release hostages? There is a growing, I think the return of partisan politics in Israel has come about in the last few weeks, with families of hostages putting pressure on the Israeli government to do more, to maybe give up more as part of a deal to get at least some of the hostages released.
But 90%, if I understand, and I listen to Dan Senor, I listen to the Times of Israel every day, I listen to, as I said, Daniel Hartman, across the spectrum, there is consensus that Hamas has to be destroyed as a threat to people living in the south of Israel. And you cannot do that unless you go into Rafah. So I think it's all nonsense. And Joe Biden's comment was just in advance of the Michigan primary. And they've now learned, haven't they, that this pro-Hamas vote just isn't very big.
I mean, yeah, let's talk about the Michigan primary. You had 13% of voters cast an uncommitted ballot in Michigan, which was not substantially higher than the uncommitted vote against Obama in 2012. It was about 10 to 11% of the vote. It's all in Dearborn. I mean, one of the more. I mean, as going through the numbers, the base, the problem Biden has is in the college towns. It's the young voters that are off the charts, have a totally anti-Israel perspective compared to almost everyone else in the country. You look at that was where, along with Dearborn and the Arab American communities in Michigan, it was the campuses where the anti-Israel uncommitted vote was the highest. And that is good. I mean, look, Biden, he's in a no-win situation. That's the young voters have been part of the Democratic base, part of the Democratic coalition for quite some time. They really don't like Biden. They don't think he's left enough for them. And if he goes further left, he's going to lose a lot more voters in the middle. So he's in this sort of catch-22, not just in Michigan, but across the country. And you can't really placate radicals on the left and expect to actually have majority support in this country. And I think he realizes that, and they've been making symbolic gestures. They've pandered on a number of fronts, including sending some foreign policy advisors to Dearborn a couple weeks ago and talking about how tough they are on Bibi. But the reality is there's a schizophrenia between the actual policy and what they're saying. And when they're not actually supporting, even though there's, I think their policy has been supportive of Israel, in terms of deed, when you're not saying why you support Israel, when you don't have Biden, when you don't have all these leading spokesmen, Karine Jean-Pierre and folks at the podium defending why Israel needs to win this war, you're losing you're losing on more than just the political front.
Yeah, all he has to do is lose 5% of his Friends of Israel vote by virtue of his ambiguity and his dancing, and he's hurt. Last question, Josh. I was struck by the total numbers. The Republican turnout was significantly higher than the Democratic turnout. Now, it is a primary, and Joe Biden doesn't have an opponent, but he did sort of have an opponent in Michigan. They did try and turn out the vote, and Republicans romped in terms of numbers. What's that tell you for the fall? We got 45 seconds.
Yeah, I do think the Republican base is much more engaged. We'll look at the overall numbers on Super Tuesday to see if that continues in other states. I do think both parties have coalition issues. We just talked about the Democratic issues with young voters, anti-Israel, Arab in Michigan. But for Republicans, it's the suburban swing voters, and that was the challenge, not just in Michigan, but in all the other early primary and caucus states for the Republicans. So the big question for Republicans is, can Trump bring home sort of the more traditional Republican voters that voted for Nikki Haley and still have real issues with his candidacy?